What if one of New York's most beautiful mansions was also the stage for one of its darkest secrets? In the winter of 1885, the Grand Fairchild residence on Fifth Avenue stood as a jewel of the Gilded Age. But behind its limestone facade and glittering windows, a story of betrayal, conspiracy, and death was quietly unfolding. A story so disturbing that the city's most powerful men would stop at nothing to erase it forever. What began as a grieving widow's attempt to honor her husband's memory soon spiraled into a nightmare, one that ended in whispers of madness, murder, and cover-ups that still echo through history. The official records called it a simple tragedy, suicide brought on by hysteria. But newly uncovered letters, hidden for over a century inside the walls of a demolished Wall Street office, suggest something far more sinister. And at the center of it all was one woman who dared to expose the truth. Elena Fairchild. Before we unravel her story, take a moment to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We love hearing from mystery enthusiasts around the world. Because the truth about Elena Fairchild doesn't begin with her death. It begins with the strange final night of her husband's life. New York in 1885 was the height of the Gilded Age. A city of dazzling contradictions, marble mansions on one street, crowded tenements on the next. The Brooklyn Bridge had just been completed, symbolizing progress and innovation. Yet factory strikes and deadly accidents reminded everyone of the cost of industrial power. In the middle of it all stood Theodore Fairchild, wealthy, brilliant, feared, admired. They called him the Oracle of Exchange Place, a financier whose uncanny timing on the stock market earned him both fortune and enemies. His empire stretched from railroads to mining to manufacturing. To rivals, his success seemed almost supernatural. In 1878, Theodore married Eleanor Catherine Brennan, better known as Elena. She wasn't just another society wife. Sharp, beautiful, and deeply loyal, she quickly became one of New York's most admired hostesses. Their mansion at 847 Fifth Avenue was nothing less than a palace. French Second Empire architecture, soaring ceilings, marble staircases, and priceless European art. But the true heart of the mansion was Theodore's study, a locked, wood-paneled sanctuary where he kept his most guarded business documents inside a massive steel safe. Their marriage was unusual for its time. Yes, it was arranged through family connections, but it grew into a true partnership. Theodore trusted Elena's instincts, often seeking her perspective on the powerful men they entertained. She, in turn, learned the language of finance from him. They had no children, something she quietly mourned, but together they built a life of influence, wealth, and purpose. The evening of November 17, 1885 began like so many others at the Fairchild Mansion. Elena oversaw every detail of a lavish dinner: roasted duck, imported oysters, and Charlotte Russe, her husband's favorite dessert. But these dinners were never just social occasions. They were carefully staged gatherings where New York's most powerful financiers conducted business shielded by the trappings of fine wine and polished silver. That night's guest list read, like a who's who of Wall Street: Harrison Kensington, the silver-haired banker who controlled railroad financing; Marcus Cromwell, a sharp-featured shipping magnate with influence over East Coast ports; and James Wright, the youngest of the group, whose family fortune came from textile mills. Elena had seen these men many times before. Theodore always took the lead, and the others followed him with a strange, almost military obedience. But on this night, something was different. The air felt heavy, tense. The usual laughter and bold predictions were replaced by hushed voices, worried glances, and unfinished sentences. As Elena moved gracefully around the room, she caught fragments of whispers. She couldn't piece them together, but one thing was certain: something was very wrong. What happened next would shatter everything she thought she knew about her husband, and plunge her into a deadly game she could never escape. And that's where the mystery truly begins. In our next part, we'll uncover the shocking events of that fateful night and the secrets that the elite of New York worked so hard to bury. Make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon, because trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next in the tragic tale of Elena Fairchild. At first, the dinner felt ordinary, lavish, polished, the kind of evening Elena had hosted countless times. But something about the conversation was different. She caught mentions of the Pittsburgh situation, whispered in low, urgent tones. Someone even referred to it as the problem that needed to be resolved permanently. Trying to ease the tension, Elelenina made a light comment about the latest society gossip. But instead of laughter, the table fell silent. The silence was so sharp it made her cheeks flush with embarrassment. Theodore, normally attentive and protective, barely seemed to notice. His face had gone pale. His hands trembled as he lifted his wine glass, and a sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead, despite the cold November air. When she leaned close and asked softly if he was all right, he forced a smile. "It's just business," he murmured. "A complicated negotiation." But his eyes betrayed him. They were haunted, filled with something she had never seen in him before. The meal dragged on with growing awkwardness. The men's voices dropped into murmurs, shutting her out of conversations where she had once been welcomed. For the first time in her own home, she felt like an intruder, unwanted and ignored. And then, it happened. As dessert was served, Theodore's favorite, Charlotte Russe, he raised his spoon, but before it touched his lips, he gasped. His face twisted in pain. The spoon clattered against his plate as he clutched his chest. His breath came in short, panicked bursts. Elelenina rushed toward him, but before she reached his side, Theodore collapsed forward. The impact shattered crystal glasses, spilling dark red wine across the white tablecloth. For a chilling moment, it looked like blood. "Theodore!" Her scream echoed through the mansion as she fell to her knees beside him. His eyes were wide with terror. His lips moved, trying to form words, but only a terrible, gasping sound escaped. Harrison Kensington sprang into action, ordering Marcus Cromwell to fetch the physician and telling the servants to clear the room. James Wright gently pulled Elelenina back, assuring her that Dr. Henley would know what to do. 20 agonizing minutes later, Dr. Purcell Henley arrived, his face heavy with practiced concern. He examined Theodore quickly but thoroughly, and then straightened with a solemn shake of his head. "I'm afraid Mr. Fairchild has passed away," he declared, his voice carrying both sympathy and authority. Given his recent complaints of chest pain and the strain of his work, it appears to have been a heart attack. A tragedy, but not an uncommon one. Elelenina's world collapsed. Her partner, her protector, her greatest love, gone in an instant. Through her tears, she barely noticed the quiet efficiency with which the men moved. Kensington whispering something into the doctor's ear. Cromwell slipping away with Theodore's plate and glass. Wright signaling the butler to clear the table with unusual haste. In her grief, none of it registered. The newspapers soon told the official story. Wall Street's brilliant oracle, claimed by the pressures of success. Friends and rivals alike offered condolences, praising Theodore's genius, framing his death as a cautionary tale about ambition and overwork. But Elelenina could not forget the look in his eyes, the sheer terror etched into them in his final moments. Something about that night was wrong, very wrong. The weeks that followed were a blur of condolence visits, legal matters, and endless documents. Theodore's lawyer, Cornelius Dalton, guided her kindly through the process, explaining what she now controlled, or what, he hinted, she might entrust to more experienced hands. As she sifted through the empire Theodore left behind, she realized it was even larger than she had imagined. Railroads, mines, factories, newspapers, banks, shipping lines. The scope was staggering. But it was the timing of his deals that unsettled her most. Again and again she found the same pattern. Selling stocks just before disasters, buying into companies days before their rivals collapsed, making lucky choices right before tragedies struck. At first, she told herself it was genius, luck, business intuition. But deep inside, a terrible thought began to take root. What if Theodore's brilliance hadn't come from luck at all? What she discovered next would shake her faith in everything she thought she knew, and reveal that her husband's fortune had been built on secrets darker than she could ever have imagined. So stay with us, because this story is only just beginning. And trust me, you'll want to hear what comes next. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next chapter of Elelenina Fairchild's haunting story. The man she had married wasn't just talented. He seemed almost supernatural in the way he predicted market crashes, strikes, and industrial booms. But the deeper Elelenina dug into Theodore's records, the less it looked like intuition. and the more it felt like something darker. The timing of his investments wasn't just fortunate, it was impossibly precise, as if he already knew disasters were coming. One evening, while sorting through his papers, she came across a locked drawer in his study. Neither she nor the staff had ever seen it open. With the help of a locksmith, the drawer finally yielded its secrets, and what Elelanina found inside would shatter everything she thought she knew about her husband. There were neatly clipped newspaper articles about industrial accidents, rail crashes, even the sudden deaths of rival businessmen, each carefully dated, each annotated in Theodore's exact handwriting. But that wasn't all. Stacked beneath them were coded telegrams and cryptic letters from men she didn't recognize. Messages signed only with initials, letters that spoke of solutions to problems and permanent resolutions to business conflicts. They weren't negotiations. They read like plans for criminal conspiracies. One letter in particular froze her blood. Dated just 3 weeks before Theodore's death, it was written on fine paper with no letterhead. It ended with the signature HK and referred to something Elelanina remembered hearing at that fateful dinner. The Pittsburgh problem. The letter urged decisive action and promised that an associate had already been contacted, with payment arranged for services rendered. Her hands shook as she held the page. Harrison Kensington, he carried those same initials. The dignified banker who had consoled her on the night of Theodore's death. Could he have been part of something sinister all along? From that moment, Elelanina's grief transformed into obsession. As the bitter winter of 1886 settled over New York, she spent hours in her late husband's study, charting timelines, drawing connections between Theodore's deals and the tragedies that cleared the way for them. A chilling picture began to emerge. Rail accidents, mine collapses, factory explosions, all conveniently timed, all followed by Theodore's sudden and brilliant financial gains. But as her investigation deepened, her social world began to unravel. Once warm friends turned cold. Conversation stopped when she entered a room. At charity galas and dinners, eyes slid away from hers as though she carried something dangerous. Even Dr. Henley, the physician who had pronounced Theodore dead, began calling on her with unsettling frequency. His tone was polite, his words framed as concern, but the questions were too pointed. How was she spending her time? Was she dwelling too much on business matters? Was her grief making her unstable? When she mentioned looking into Theodore's affairs, his expression hardened, cloaked in what he called concern for her delicate constitution. But the most disturbing realization was this: she was being watched. Strangers loitered on Fifth Avenue, their eyes fixed on her door. Papers she had carefully arranged in Theodore's study were moved when she returned to the room. It felt as though invisible hands were reaching into her life, into her very sanity. By spring, her fear had hardened into resolve. Theodore's death had not been natural. She was certain of it now. And the empire he left behind had been built on deliberate, calculated destruction. But the men responsible weren't just businessmen. They were powerful, untouchable, and if they had silenced Theodore, what would they do to his widow? Her first breakthrough came from someone unexpected: Margaret O'Brien, the Irish cook who had served in the Fairchild household for 6 years. One morning in April, Margaret approached her, wringing her hands nervously. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Fairchild," she said in her soft Dublin accent, "but there's something I need to tell you about the night Mr. Theodore passed." Elelanina braced herself. "I was in the kitchen when Dr. Henley left that evening," Margaret continued, voice trembling, "and I saw him speaking with Mr. Kensington by the garden gate." What happened next would confirm Elelanina's worst fears. They thought no one was listening, but Margaret, the loyal cook, had been standing by the pantry window that night, and what she overheard has haunted her ever since. She leaned toward Elelanina, her voice shaking. "Clear as day, ma'am. I heard Mr. Kensington say, the dose was perfect. No one will ever suspect." Elelanina froze, her papers slipping from her hands. Margaret's eyes darted nervously, and then Dr. Henley replied, "Just remember our agreement about the widow. She must never learn what we know." They shook hands like it was a bargain sealed in blood. The words landed like a physical blow. The dose could only mean poison, subtle, precise, designed to look like a heart attack. The men who had sat at her table, who had consoled her in grief, had been Theodore's killers all along. From that moment, Eleanor's sorrow hardened into something sharper, cold, burning rage. She began to re-examine every memory of that night. Dr. Henley's arrival, too quick, almost as if he'd been waiting for the call. The dinner guests, tense and restless, glancing at one another as though they were holding their breath. The way they handled the emergency with an efficiency too practiced to be spontaneous. It hadn't been chaos. It had been choreography. Eleanor dug deeper, making quiet inquiries about the men who had dined with her husband that night. And what she uncovered chilled her to the core. Harrison Kensington had made fortunes off railroad investments, always after a rival line collapsed in sudden, suspicious disaster. Marcus Cromwell's shipping empire had ballooned after fires, accidents, and bankruptcies conveniently cleared his competitors from the seas. James Wayright's textile mills thrived while rivals were crushed under endless streaks of tragedy. Different industries. Same pattern, their fortunes rose, only when others fell. The truth became undeniable. These men weren't just businessmen. They were predators, running what could only be called a murder-for-profit enterprise. Accidents weren't accidents. Suicides weren't suicides. Every death was an opportunity. Every disaster a payday. And Theodore? He hadn't been a genius who predicted markets. He had been one of them. The strategist, the analyst who chose the targets. The Fairchild fortune was soaked in blood. That knowledge nearly broke her. The wealth that had once brought her comfort and status was now a prison, paid for with the lives of men destroyed in secret. But Eleanor's horror soon turned to fear, because the walls were closing in. Invitations stopped arriving. Friends she'd once trusted now avoided her on the street. And worse, strangers began appearing inside her life. New servants recommended by Kensington's office. Letters tampered with, shifted ever so slightly, as though someone had been rifling through her desk. She wasn't imagining it. She was being watched. And Dr. Henley? His visits became constant, his questions sharper. He spoke of nervous conditions, of the need for rest. And then, his suggestion, a private sanitarium. A place where she could be taken care of. The meaning was clear. If she resisted, they would lock her away. If she kept digging, she might not live long enough to tell anyone what she had found. The elegant mansion that once held laughter and music now felt like a gilded cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of candlelight carried the question. Was tonight the night they would silence her for good? By the summer of 1886, Eleanor knew she had little time left. Her investigation had grown beyond Kensington, Cromwell, and Wayrigh. The conspiracy reached deeper, darker, more powerful than she had ever imagined, and she was running out of places to hide. What she uncovered next would change everything. What if the man you loved had been keeping a secret ledger? One that didn't just track finances, but murders. That's exactly what Elena Fairchild uncovered when she pried open the last hiding place in her late husband's office. Behind a false panel in the safe, she found a leather-bound book. And inside, the truth spilled out in Theodore's own careful handwriting. This wasn't business accounting. It was a record of assassinations. Each entry listed a name, a reason for their elimination. Phrases like market impediment or competitive interference, the method of death, the payout, and the date it was carried out. Chillingly precise. One rival resolved through a staged carriage accident in 1883. Profits, $180,000. Another, a shipping magnate addressed by apparent suicide in 1884. 3 trade routes gained overnight. A textile factory owner concluded in a fire that claimed not just his life, but 17 innocent workers, profits exceeding $200,000. And that was only the beginning. The ledger revealed a network of professional killers, men identified only by numbers. Agent 7 specialized in carriage accidents. Agent 12 staged fires and industrial disasters. Agent 23, he perfected the art of poisoning that left no trace. Theodore had been their strategist. He chose the victims, calculated the timing, and ensured maximum profit. Kensington handled the money. Cromwell arranged the logistics. Wayrigh controlled the officials who kept investigations shallow and harmless. It was all there, in black and white. And then, Eleanor reached the final page. Her blood ran cold. The last unfinished entry read, E.F. Widow, excessive curiosity. Permanent resolution required. Her own name, her own death. scheduled like a business transaction. From that moment, Eleanor knew the truth. She wasn't just grieving a murdered husband. She was next, and the conspiracy wasn't small. It reached everywhere: judges, police captains, editors, even members of New York's own Board of Health. These men weren't businessmen anymore. They were untouchable, operating with impunity for over a decade. The attack started almost immediately. A chandelier came crashing down, seconds after she had stepped out from under it. A gas leak in her bedroom, caught only because Margaret smelled it in time. A carriage wheel that snapped on Fifth Avenue, nearly killing her. Each incident designed to look like fate. But Eleanor knew better. They were testing methods, deciding how she should accidentally die. And all the while, Dr. Henley's visits grew more sinister. This time, he didn't come alone. He brought Dr. Reginald Steinberg, a so-called expert in nervous disorders. Together, they questioned her for hours, trying to paint her as paranoid, delusional, unstable. The plan was clear. If they couldn't kill her, they would have her locked away. A sanitarium, a cage with no escape. And once inside, she'd never be believed again. For Eleanor, the choice was clear: act now or be erased forever. Her plan: risky, reckless, but it was her only chance. She would gather every piece of evidence, the ledger, the photographs, Margaret's testimony, and send them not just to the police in New York, but to federal officials, newspapers, and out-of-state lawmen who weren't already owned by the conspiracy. It was a race against time. Every day she stayed alive was borrowed time, and what happened next would determine whether Elena Fairchild exposed one of the darkest conspiracies in American history or became its next forgotten victim. What if the only way to survive was to play along with the very people plotting your death? That's exactly what Eleanor Fairchild was forced to do in the fall of 1886. By day, she played her part, the grieving widow, pale and exhausted, submitting to Dr. Henley's endless examinations. She attended luncheons, accepted condolences, and gave every appearance of a woman slowly unraveling under the weight of loss. But it was all an act. Behind the curtain of her performance, Eleanor was assembling the most dangerous case in New York. She had compiled lists of deaths that matched perfectly with her husband's investments. Each tragedy wasn't random, it was profitable. Each name, each accident, part of a pattern too precise to dismiss. She built a timeline. She gathered Margaret's sworn testimony. She photographed Theodore's ledger, decoded the correspondence, and tied every murder to financial gains worth millions. And she made 4 complete copies. 3 were meant for her allies: a federal prosecutor who specialized in interstate commerce crimes, the editor of the Herald Tribune, and a Philadelphia detective untouched by New York's corruption. The 4th was hidden in a bank vault beyond the reach of the conspirators. Her plan was risky but brilliant: deliver all the evidence in a single day, overwhelming the network so completely that they couldn't silence every investigation at once. But the conspirators weren't blind. On the morning of October 8th, Eleanor rose early, dressed carefully, and prepared for what could be her last day of freedom, or her last day alive. Margaret noticed 2 strange men stationed on the corners outside, and then came the knock at the door. Dr. Henley had arrived unannounced, claiming she faced a medical emergency, and he wasn't alone. At his side was Dr. Reginald Steinberg, the so-called expert in nervous disorders. Both men were agitated, checking their watches, insisting they must see Eleanor immediately. Margaret whispered urgently, "Ma'am, you look perfectly well. Something isn't right." "He seems nervous, too nervous." Eleanor's pulse quickened. She knew instantly the conspiracy had discovered her plan. If she allowed Henley to take control, she'd be committed within the hour, locked away in a sanitarium, erased without a trace. So she made a split-second choice. She told Margaret to stall, say she was faint, say she needed time to compose herself. And while Henley waited in the parlor, Eleanor slipped down the servants' stairs, grabbed her evidence packets, and disappeared into the alley behind the mansion. Her escape through Manhattan became a deadly game of cat and mouse. She could feel eyes on her. Men followed. Every step confirmed the truth. The network had unleashed its hunters. And yet she pressed on. Her first destination, the federal building. Breathless, she demanded to see Prosecutor Williams, only to be told he'd been called away on urgent business. The clerk's tone was rehearsed, his eyes avoiding hers. She left the packet anyway, praying it would reach him, though in her heart she knew it never would. Her second meeting with the Herald Tribune ended even worse. The editor, Morrison, had fallen suddenly ill, hospitalized that very morning. Eleanor's stomach turned. The timing was no coincidence. The conspiracy had moved faster than she imagined, her allies silenced one by one. By the time she rushed to Grand Central Station for her final hope, the Philadelphia detective, her desperation was raw. The crowds, the clamor of trains, the echo of the departure board. For a brief moment, she felt almost safe, until she saw his face. Detective Patrick Kelly stood waiting. But not with sympathy, not with urgency. His expression was sharp, hostile, and his very first words shattered what little hope she had left. What he said next would decide whether Eleanor Fairchild lived to tell her story, or became just another carefully scripted death in Theodore's murderous ledger. What if the very man you trusted to protect you turned out to be part of the trap? That's what Eleanor Fairchild discovered inside Grand Central Station on October 8, 1886. She had risked everything to get there, evidence in hand, her last hope pinned on Detective Patrick Kelly, a contact she believed was safe from New York's corruption. But when she met his eyes, her blood ran cold. Kelly spoke softly, almost kindly. "Mrs. Fairchild, I've been contacted by some very concerned parties about your condition. Dr. Henley has explained everything to me in great detail." In that moment, Eleanor knew. He'd been compromised, another piece bought off by bribes and poisoned with lies about her sanity. Her voice cracked with desperation. "Detective, please, listen to me. The evidence proves it. My husband and his associates have been murdering for profit. There's a ledger, dozens of assassinations. Theodore was poisoned at my own dinner table." But Kelly only tilted his head with pity, speaking as though to a fragile patient. "Ma'am, you've been under tremendous strain since your husband's death. These delusions are understandable, but dangerous. The best thing you can do is come with me peacefully. Dr. Henley is waiting outside with an ambulance." Eleanor's chest tightened. It was over. Every door closed, every ally neutralized. The private facility he mentioned wasn't treatment. It was a prison, a graveyard for the inconvenient. But she refused to go quietly. With sudden force, she wrenched herself free and ran toward the main concourse, her voice echoing across the vast station. "They killed my husband. Harrison Kensington and Marcus Cromwell are murderers. They've been killing for money." Travelers stopped in their tracks, staring as the elegant widow unraveled in public. Eleanor's voice broke but grew louder. "Dr. Henley poisoned Theodore. They're trying to silence me. Don't let them." The spectacle was exactly what the conspirators had engineered. Her desperation looked like madness. Her truth sounded like delusion, and then Henley appeared, perfectly timed. Two orderlies in white coats followed close behind. "Please, everyone, stand back," Henley announced, his tone heavy with compassion and authority. "This poor woman has been suffering terribly since her husband's death. She believes people are trying to harm her. We're here to help her," the crowd murmured sympathetically. To them, Eleanor wasn't a whistleblower. She was a broken widow, lost to hysteria. She fought, screaming, kicking against the orderly's grip. But the harder she struggled, the more she seemed to confirm Henley's diagnosis. And as she was dragged toward the waiting ambulance, Eleanor caught sight of a figure watching from the shadows. Harrison Kensington, his lips curled into the faintest smile, the look of a man savoring victory. The last thing she saw before the door slammed shut was Detective Kelly shaking hands with Henley, pocketing an envelope thick with cash. That day, October 8, 1886, Eleanor Catherine Fairchild was officially committed to the Westchester Private Sanitarium, under the authority of Dr. Henley and Dr. Reginald Steinberg. The records claimed she suffered from paranoid hysteria. Her accusations of murder and conspiracy were dismissed as the fantasies of a fragile, grieving woman. She was confined to a locked room, subjected to cold water treatments, forced bed rest, and heavy doses of opiates. Letters forbidden, visitors denied. It was the perfect cage, a place where inconvenient truths could be silenced under the weight of medicine. And Eleanor knew. She had been buried alive while still breathing. But what happened inside that sanitarium was darker than anyone could have imagined. What if the very people sworn to heal were the ones plotting your death? This is the forgotten story of Elena Fairchild, widow, heiress, and ultimately victim of one of the darkest conspiracies in America's Gilded Age. When Elena was locked away in the Westchester Sanitarium, her loyal cook, Margaret O'Brien, tried again and again to visit. Each time she was turned away. Doctors claimed Elena was too unstable, that seeing familiar faces might trigger dangerous episodes, but Margaret refused to give up. Her persistence eventually brought her face to face with Dr. Peeble Henley himself. Calm, reassuring, persuasive. He explained that Elena's mind was crumbling and that isolation was necessary. What Margaret didn't realize was that her own time was running out. On November 15, 1886, exactly 1 month after Elena's confinement, Margaret was found dead in her apartment. The cause? A supposed gas leak from her stove. The police called it a tragic accident, but the timing was far too convenient. Margaret was the only person who had overheard a suspicious conversation between Dr. Henley and the wealthy Harrison Kensington. Now her voice would never be heard again. Eleanor's fate was sealed. After weeks of heavy doses of laudanum, a drug meant to treat hysteria, she was discovered lifeless in her sanitarium room on December 3, 1886. The official cause was listed as heart failure brought on by emotional strain. But the truth? She had been injected with a lethal dose of morphine, a so-called treatment that was nothing less than a carefully planned execution. Her funeral was small, attended by a few acquaintances and servants. Yet among the mourners stood the very men who orchestrated her downfall: Kensington, Marcus Cromwell, and James Wainwright, wearing masks of sorrow. Their performances were flawless, their guilt invisible. The newspapers painted Eleanor as nothing more than a grieving widow who slipped into madness. An obituary in the New York Times described her as a victim of hysteria, praising Dr. Henley for his heroic efforts to save her. But the truth of her murder was buried, along with her. Behind the scenes, the Fairchild fortune, worth over $2 million, was quickly divided. Kensington's bank account swelled. Cromwell gained new shipping ventures. Wainwright secured textile mills to expand his empire. And Eleanor's mansion sold off to new money from Chicago. Every trace of Theodore Fairchild's records was destroyed, erasing the evidence of a conspiracy that had begun with him and ended with his widow. With both Theodore and Elena eliminated, the secret network of businessmen continued operating with terrifying confidence. They silenced threats, manipulated doctors and courts, and used private asylums as prisons for inconvenient witnesses. Dr. Henley thrived, gaining a reputation as an expert in treating nervous women, though his patients died at an unusually high rate. The Westchester Sanitarium ran for 15 more years before a mysterious fire conveniently destroyed its records. By the early 1900s, the conspirators themselves had passed on, remembered not as criminals, but as philanthropists, empire builders, and pioneers of American industry. Their true legacy, however, lived on in the criminal methods they perfected, methods copied by gangs, corporations, and shadowy figures for generations. And what of Elena Fairchild? History reduced her to a cautionary tale of female hysteria. Her warnings dismissed, her courage forgotten, her murder disguised as madness. Her tragedy reminds us of a chilling truth. Sometimes the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones hiding in the dark, but the ones wearing suits, smiling in public, and shaking hands in the halls of power. So, do you believe conspiracies like this really thrived in America's Gilded Age? Could history have buried even darker truths than this? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more untold mysteries from the shadows of history, don't forget to like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more chilling stories. Because sometimes, the most terrifying stories are the ones that could be true.